lot of material out there, including on my own channel, about the nuts and bolts of learning music. So, how to read music, how to read notes, how to read rhythm, how to form a chord, all that kind of thing. But if you've watched more than a couple of my videos, you'll know that I'm really, really interested in the psychology of learning, because it's really a mental game, isn't it, in piano? In order to be successful, you have to be in it for the long term. So I'm always interested in what we can borrow from other disciplines to help support our own musical journeys. And this week a video popped up in my feed talking about the process of learning a language and the benefits of a sort of total immersion approach to learning a language. And that got me thinking about, well, what are the parallels between learning language and learning music? Because of course music is a language. And the more strategies we have for supporting our own learning, the better. So let's have a look at the learning of language and see what we can borrow from it to support our own musical learning. So it's widely thought that music is in fact the first language, that before humans had speech, we had ways of communicating that were more musical, maybe through calls or whistles and even just rudimentary instruments. And that language as we know it today actually developed from that basis. So in one sense, it comes really, really naturally to us. We are just musical beings. So it shouldn't be difficult for us to express ourselves musically, and yet we are often frustrated by our inability to be as musical as we'd like to be. So let's start off by looking first of all at the way we learn language as opposed to the way we learn music. So when we're born, we're immediately immersed in a world of sound. We have people around us speaking whatever language we're born into, and quite often there's a lot of music around us as well. So when we start off at a very, very young age, we're likely to be putting in place the foundations for both of those languages, the speech that we're going to use and our musical expression. Simply because we learn both in the same way, by total immersion, by hearing the sounds of language, by hearing rhythm and music around us. But at a certain point, those two things, speech and music, start to diverge. So as regards speech, we'll start to develop a vocabulary, put together sentences, and it goes from there. We can become more and more complex in the way we can express ourselves linguistically. Whereas music will seem to reach a certain plateau and stay put, unless it's really, really tended to early on in life. And we know that children that come from families where music isn't really part of their life don't develop the same sense of rhythm, they don't develop the same sense of musicality as children from families where music is really just part of the fabric of life. And if we take that to an extreme, we know that people who have perfect pitch are likely to have developed that before the age of 5 through their immersion in music. So we're talking about families who are absolutely musical to their core in these cases, and children who are interacting with music every day, and that's how we develop perfect pitch. As a side note, not having perfect pitch is not a problem to any musician. Relative pitch is more important, and in fact perfect pitch can be a difficulty in some ways. So straight off, if you don't have perfect pitch, don't worry about it, it's not that important. Nice to have, but not essential. So the difference essentially is that music is not practiced in the same way that language is practiced. We're exposed to language from all angles every day of our life, literally from the day we're born. We can't help but acquire it. Whereas in most cases, music is something that we have now and then. More in some families, less in others. Sometimes the radio is on, sometimes it isn't. Maybe we have a parent who sings to us, maybe we don't. But it's much more hit and miss. So at this stage, if you're thinking, well, how can I support my children to become more musical? Or maybe you're thinking about your grandchildren. Well, there's absolutely lots that you can do to make music more of a regular part of their lives. And that can be as simple as listening to music with them, playing instruments with them, simple instruments, xylophones and shakers and drums and things like that, dancing with them, singing with them, helping them develop a sense of beat and a sense of music and a sense of pitch. If you want to include a social aspect to it, which is really important as well, you could bring them along to music together classes, kinder music classes, anything like that that just gets them interacting with music and making that a normal part of their life. So up until now, I've really been comparing your native language to music rather than the acquisition of a second language, and that's a different process. So let's talk about that now, because that is more like most of our experiences of learning music. It's really like acquiring a second language. And how fluent we become in a second language depends on having two pillars in place. One is the academic side of learning a language, and the other is the immersive side of learning a language. Most of us have the experience of learning a second language in school, and we know what it's like to go through the process of learning verbs and grammatical structure and having that in place, practicing vocabulary, and hopefully at the end of our course of study, be that when we leave school or university, we can converse quite well in a language. We can get by. We maybe just have a few words, but enough to help us if we're on holidays in a country, but we're by no means fluent. And for that to happen, we need to really immerse ourselves more completely. And that can happen in a number of ways. The most obvious one is that we go to that country, we surround ourselves with people who speak that language, and we try every day to actually converse with those people. And over time, we become more fluent in the language. But especially if you live in Europe and you have friends on the continent who speak English better than you do as an English speaker, then you probably know that there is another way of acquiring language, which is is really quite surprising but very effective. A lot of people in Europe who speak English really, really well learnt it from listening to the radio and TV channels and watching movies and learning songs. So that's another way of immersing yourself in a language, really hearing it in everyday contexts and making it a natural part of your environment. And the question arises, do you need both of these strands? Do you need the academic and the immersive in order to become fluent? And I'd argue that yes, you actually do need both. If you only have the academic side of things, then your language is always going to be a little bit stilted, a little bit formal. It won't be flowing, it won't be natural. Whereas if you don't have the academic grounding and you learn the language just entirely by immersion in that language, the chances are that you may be able to speak really well and get your point across and really converse quite naturally, but your grammar will never be quite up to scratch. And native speakers listening to you will always know that it's not your first language. So if your aim is to become truly fluent in a second language, then you need to have both of those. You need to have the formal study that gives you the grammatical basis and the syntax and the vocabulary and all that. And then you also need to have the immersive experience to really allow that skill to blossom and come to its full potential. So how can we relate this to music? Well, music, as we said, is also a language. It has its vocabulary, its syntax, its grammar, its rules. And then we have the side that is purely about expression and anything goes, and any sounds that we're making that sound good to us, they're definitely good. And if you can bring those two aspects together, then you have a really beautiful foundation to express yourselves through music. And at this point, a lot of you are thinking, well, I have no background in learning music. I didn't learn how to read music. I don't know how to count rhythm. I just know how to play. I taught myself and I learned by ear. And I've no doubt that if you can do that, then you're truly a very musical person. And if you enjoy doing that, then fantastic. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it's not the full picture. So if you are that person as regards music, and if you're happy with that situation, then that's absolutely fine. There's no problem with that at all. But of course, that approach really excludes you from playing a lot of the classical repertoire because most of it is too complex to learn by ear. And of course, that's also fine if you're a traditional musician because a lot of that isn't based on written music and it's all learned by ear. But if you're a piano player, then the chances are you'll want to have some of the classical repertoire at your fingertips as well. And if you've relied entirely on immersion to learn, then you may not have the foundation that you need to be able to tackle the classical side of things. So for that, you will need the other side of the equation, which is the formal academic approach to learning music, which is learning the grammar, learning the syntax. And that means learning how to read music, learning how to read rhythm, understanding music theory. And for me, there are two particular areas of music that I equate with the academic side of learning a language. So if you're learning a language in school, you're going to be going through, your verb conjugations and your lists of prepositions and particular constructions that need to be just learned off initially. And that's a bit like learning music theory, first of all, but also doing technical exercises. So being able to conjugate a verb, for example, without thinking too hard about it is just like being able to play a technical exercise. The point of it is not that, in itself, okay, I can play this exercise or I can conjugate this verb. The point is that when you do go to use that in context, in a conversation, in a piece of music, you don't need to think about it. The information is at your fingertips, it's ready to go. And you can also think of technical exercises like tongue twister exercises. If you're learning a language that's particularly difficult for you to pronounce, then you're going to have exercises or you're going to have to spend time really being slow and careful about how you pronounce words until it becomes more natural. And your technical exercises in music are going to do the same thing for you. It's helping your fingers pronounce the musical words that you need, that you'll then find in your music and you won't even need to think about it. Your fingers will just know what to do. So if you ever needed a reason to do technical exercises, that's the reason. It's developing your musical vocabulary. And music theory then is really about understanding the grammar of music, the syntax of music. And people are often scared by even just the term music theory makes people shudder a little bit because it sounds like it's a huge, vast body of knowledge that you have to wade through and it's so difficult. But it really isn't. When you start to learn the names of notes, you're already learning music theory. And particularly if you're going to put it straight into practice, then it's not so much this dry academic theory with no application. You're using it straight away in the music and it's going to make sense. So if you think of it that way, it's not as difficult as all that. And if you are careful about how you progress through your music, then it shouldn't cause too much difficulty. Of course, there are always moments of having to try and understand a new concept that can be quite daunting, quite difficult. But once you're over each hump, you're through to the next round and you can keep going. And the parallels between learning music and learning language also extend to how quickly we can progress. So if you're learning a language in school, for example, you're not going to go from, first year French, conjugating the verb to be, to the next year, you know, reading Jean-Paul Sartre in French. That's not going to happen. You're going to go very gradually up through adding a little bit of vocabulary here and there, a new concept in grammar, really building your foundation from the bottom up and adding it brick by brick so that you end up with a really good knowledge of that language. And music is exactly the same. The biggest mistake people make is to go from zero to a complicated piece of music. So think of it as jumping into a language at the wrong end. You really wouldn't do that. You wouldn't consider, you know, learning French by opening, you know, an original language version of Les Miserables or something like that. You'd start with something really easy and start to build from there. So music is exactly the same way. We don't want to leap too far ahead too quickly. We progress slowly up through the various grades, the various levels. And part of doing that is to not be in too much of a hurry to move on to the next level either, because if you're learning a language, for example, you'll want to repeat the same conversations again and again until it feels natural. So in music, that can be, you know, if you're at around elementary level, for example, at the moment, don't be in too much of a hurry to move on to the next level. Really find lots of pieces around that level and play through lots and lots of different styles so that you're coming across the same material in different ways. So that when you start to move up a little bit, you're adding some new vocabulary, a new grammatical idea, a new understanding of the syntax. And from the immersive point of view, you can do the same thing. You can be listening to a lot of music around that level, following scores, reading scores. Now that you can do at different levels. If you have a piece of music that you're particularly in love with and you hope that someday you'll be able to play, what you can do in the meantime is have that piece of music and have a good recording of it and take the time now and again to read through it, follow it while you're listening to somebody else play it and hone in on different details. There's a huge amount that you can learn just from doing that. And of course, immersion can also mean playing by ear, trying to figure out things yourself, doing some improvisation, composing your own music, just making up little bits and pieces as you go. And of course, being regular about it. You know, doing a little bit of music practice once a week isn't immersion, and it's probably not academic either. It's neither approach. So it does need to be a little and often, just as you're told to do when learning a language. 5 to 10 minutes every day, much better than an hour once a week. In music, probably want to do a little bit more than that because it is quite a difficult skill to master over time. But a small chunk of practice every day is going to beat, you know, a marathon session at the weekend anytime. So hopefully this video will have given you some food for thought. First of all, you want to think about, well, how fluent do I want to be in music as a language? And if I want to be really fluent, then am I prepared to put the study in on both sides of the equation? On the academic side, where I'm looking at music theory and I'm being really careful about going through graded progressions of music, and on the other side, can I find ways of immersing myself? Can I listen to music in a more analytical way? Can I follow scores? Can I improvise? Can I play by ear? And can I dedicate the time every day, or at least 4 or 5 times a week, to push forward in the study of this wonderful language? Whichever approach you take, it's really important to have some good practice techniques. So if you haven't already downloaded my practice technique workbook, it's completely free. Go into the description here underneath and sign up to get that. I'll send it out to you straight away and it'll get you started in learning music faster, to be perfectly honest. A good practice technique will take an awful lot of time out of the process of learning music. So I hope you'll grab yourself a copy of that, and I'll talk to you soon. In the meantime, happy practicing.